The 40s did see the introduction of more science fiction blended into the horror, no doubt because of the advancements in science during this time. Universal continued its highly successful series of horror films, including a revival of The Wolfman in the 1940s and the later 1940s, even as horror found itself in decline. Sequels and imitators like The Mummy's Hand, The Mummy's Curse, and The Mummy's Tomb, and Frankenstein vs. Wolfman, they all came out in the late 1940s, but the audiences weren't eating these films up the way they were the original Universal horror pictures. Many rather unsuccessful attempts at recreating the big genre films took place in the 1940s. The 1950s continued the tradition of adding science into horror movies. The atomic age added to the fear of the nuclear bomb to the basic primal fears that were present in all horror movies. The Wasp Woman and The Earth Stood Still were two prime examples of this, and the Cold War played a big part in changing the genre and making these films popular. The Cold War also added to the fears of people had of outsiders. So The Day the Earth Stood Still, for example, dealt with an alien-like creature in the form of a robot that came to Earth. Other films include The Blob, and as I said, The Day the Earth Stood Still, and The Wasp Woman. These movies were uniquely American. They were very pro-American and anti-communist. The anti-communist feelings often make the movies come off as cartoonish, but they were horror movies. The scientific advances also led to horrors based on genetic mutations and a fear of human-animal hybrids. These played out on screens, in the screen, in movies like Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, Godzilla, and the aforementioned Wasp Woman. These commonly experienced themes meant that horror was back on the rise and more popular than ever. The 1950s focused a lot on sci-fi and horror movies, but the 1960s really changed that. The movies became darker and more, you could argue, repulsive. Phil Hardy, in the Encyclopedia of Horror Movies, he said that in 1931, that was the creation of the horror genre itself with Dracula and Frankenstein and Wolfman. But in 1957, he says, saw the start of the modern horror movie as it exists today. The House on Haunted Hill, starring Vincent Price, scared audiences in 1960. The decade also included movies such as Psycho, where the villain was a mortal man, and even the aforementioned House on Haunted Hill, the killer was a mortal man. So the genre changed a lot. Rosemary's Baby came out, and satanic forces and the cult forces were introduced. George Romero introduced the world to zombie-like characters and even zombies with Night of the Living Dead, which was released in 1968 or 1969. The 1970s really reinvented the genre. The end of the Hays Code, which censored films in the United States, meant that there was more freedom for up-and-coming filmmakers to ply their trade and push the envelope like never before. Others were to follow, and these played on a new fascination with Satanism and the occult and anti-religious ideas. These movies included The Exorcist, The Omen, movies like The Amityville Horror, and other movies such as those. The decade also saw the rise of low-budget pictures, which allowed new filmmakers to get into the horror genre, and a lot of these came out into two new subgenres called the splatter flick and the slasher film. The first true slasher film was Halloween from John Carpenter in 1978. Tobe Hooper came out with The Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974, and this was the first true splatter flick. Both films have changed the genre of horror in general forever. The 1980s are famous for more slasher films, including the rise of movies focusing on teens, and especially teens having sex. They get into trouble when they have sex, and there's kind of a mortality, a moral play there as well. These include movies like Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th, where that sexual play among teens really comes into play. The 1980s continue the tradition of horror movie sequels with more Halloween, Friday the 13th, and more of the lovable Freddy Krueger fans couldn't get enough of. And that's actually mainly in the 90s. The real game changer in the 90s was the 1999 film, The Blair Witch Project. It had a budget of $60,000 and profits of over $250 million worldwide. The start of the century saw even more changes. The movies became more darker, more violent, and more grotesque. Remakes hit big in theaters with a new vision of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and even a new Halloween film, and they really fit the times. They were bloodier, more violent, more gruesome, more graphic, and they contained a lot more sex than the films of the previous eras. Horror cinema has been around as long as cinema itself. It has been a vital part of the evolution of film as a genre, as an art form. It's highly respected in its earliest forms because of the new fascination people have with it. But over the years, critics and audiences alike have attacked the genre as too lowbrow to be given too much respect, too unsophisticated to tackle the really serious issues, and it'll probably never win any big awards. You'll never see a horror film win anything at the Academy Awards, most likely. The genre will probably never even reach its peak of popularity that it had in the early part of the 20th century, but that's okay. Horror is here to stay. The base fears that we all share as humans will remain, and horror movies will continue to exploit those fears in any way it can.